Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all well. It's such an honor to be here today. I would like to thank Studio Rizoma for the invitation to come and speak to all of you and to amplify the African voice. Thank you so much. I'm a climate activist from Kampala, Uganda. I work with the Rise Up movement as the national coordinator. The Rise Up movement was started by Vanessa Nakate, who is one of the prominent activists around the world. And she started this movement after seeing that most times African voices are being left out of conferences. Every time she went for a climate conference, she would not see an African voice or maybe seeing herself alone. So she started this movement to amplify voices of African activists. And this is the reason why I'm here today, and this is the reason why you all are listening to me and not only listening to one African voice. So the Rise Up movement, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the Rise Up movement. It has grown so much and it has spread all over different African countries, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Kenya, in North Africa, in South Africa, in Nigeria. And African voices are rising up and are growing and are speaking up. We are running quite a number of projects as the Rise Up movement, like the Vash Green Schools project, which involves installation of eco-friendly cook stoves and solar panels in rural schools. This is to promote renewable energy. And I'm heading a project called Plus One Tree Project, which involves planting fruit trees in households in Uganda, because I realized while moving around, fruit trees are the trees that are still standing. And we all know that trees are a carbon sink to the planet. We also have the Girl on the Move initiative, which is headed by one of my colleagues, Isaac Sentumbwe. And this project is there to empower women and young girls who have been impacted by the climate crisis. So I started climate activism in 2019 after seeing my fellow activist, Vanessa Nakate, carry out her individual protests on the streets of Kampala. I personally didn't know about climate change because the education system did not do me much justice to tell me about the climate crisis. I was only seeing weather patterns changing. I was seeing very long drought spells. I was seeing women walking very long distances to look for water and food to feed their families. I kept on seeing girls dropping out of school, children dropping out of school, girls being given away for marriage as a result of everything being lost because of the climate disasters, because of the floods. And I did not connect this to the climate crisis until I started taking online courses and doing research, and I realized that climate change is one of the biggest challenges that my community, Uganda, is experiencing. The prolonged droughts in the northern part of Uganda that are drying up people's crops, that are drying up water sources, and this is threatening food security, forcing women to walk long distances to look for food and water to feed their families, and as a result, this is exposing them to trafficking and sexual violence. And as well, during crises, girls are usually the first to drop out of school. Yes, boys drop out of school as well, but there are groups that are more vulnerable than others. You find that the girl child, when they drop out of school, they are given away for marriage in exchange for bride price. If I'm to explain to you what bride price is it's a form of property or wealth that is given to a girl's parent when they are given away for marriage. And why are they giving away the girl child? This is because this is the only hope that they have to survive, because the food sources have dried up, the water sources have dried up. For your information, many African countries heavily depend on agriculture for survival. But because of the climate crisis, this is being threatened. And this is why so many families that depend on agriculture look for other sources of money. And this is how the girl child ends up being given away in exchange for bride price. And as well, we are seeing devastating floods in the western part of Uganda that are destroying schools, that are destroying homes, that are destroying hospitals. So the climate crisis is interconnected. I'm here to explain to you that what I'm talking about right now is connected to everything that is being discussed today. The climate crisis is so much interconnected. It's an environmental issue. It's a racial justice issue. It's a social justice issue. It is everything. One thing leads to the other. When we talk about environmental justice, communities, Black and brown communities, are the communities that are being targeted or that are experiencing the climate crisis differently. Yes, the climate crisis is affecting all of us. It's affecting the whole world, but some people are being impacted more than others. We are already seeing devastating disasters everywhere in some parts of the world. When we look at Europe, the present is not yet so catastrophic compared to Africa. In Africa, it is very bad. People are dying. People are suffering from floods, from disasters. The present is already catastrophic in my country. So when I say the climate crisis is an environmental issue, some communities are already being impacted more than others. The people from Africa are already experiencing the worst impacts right now. When we say the climate crisis is a racial justice issue, Black and brown communities are being impacted already. When you look at most of the projects that are happening right now, let me give an example of the East African crude oil pipeline, which is going to run from my country, Uganda. This pipeline is being funded by Total, a French company. And this pipeline looks like a door to wealth, but it's going to destroy communities in Uganda. Communities in Uganda have already been displaced. So this means that people's heritages have been displaced. People's cultures have been lost. And we all know that we cannot adapt to some things. We cannot adapt to lost cultures. We cannot adapt to lost heritages. We cannot adapt to some of these things, much as we are calling upon leaders to provide a finance for people to be able to adapt, but some things cannot be adapted to. So the climate crisis, I can give you examples of how people are being impacted in Africa or in my country, Uganda. During the lockdown in 2020, about 17,000 girls got pregnant during the lockdown, during COVID pandemic. This is the same for climate change. During periods of crises, certain groups of people are being impacted more. About 1.7 million people in South Sudan are being affected by starvation. A report was released by BBC last year that 2.5 million people in Africa are at a risk of starvation. These are things that are very true, and there are statistics and there are evidence to show that these are things that are happening. Early this year, the tropical storm Anna affected millions and thousands of people in Madagascar. People lost their lives, people lost their homes, people lost their properties. And again, we saw in South Africa a storm and a flood that affected millions of people. Millions of people died from this storm. And I'll come back later and explain that to you about loss and damage, because everything that I'm explaining right now it's very clear that loss and damage is already happening in Africa. Then when we look at another form of colonialism, I talked about the East African crude oil pipeline. This pipeline looks like a door to wealth, but all the wealth is going back to the global north, and it's not going to remain in Africa. But again, this pipeline is going to pass through Maxon Falls National Park, and part of it is going to pass through Lake Victoria, which has millions of species of aquatic life. And part of it is passing through the National Falls National Park, which is going to endanger wildlife. And in case of an oil spill, my country has to go through the oil spill, not the global north, where all the profits are going to go to. When you read about this pipeline, about 97% of shares belong to Total. So who owns the 3% shares? This is very clear that all the profits are going back to the global north, and this is a form of colonialism. While the African people are looking at this or are being brainwashed and greenwashed, that this is something that is going to bring wealth to them. This is something that is going to destroy the planet. This is something that is going to lead people to a point of destruction, to a point of no return, to more disasters. The African continent does not need any more colonialism or any more form of fossil fuels that are destroying the planet. I know many of you are probably not environmentalists or do not understand so much about climate change, but climate change is impacting everything in this planet. Climate change is interconnected. It affects everything. If you do research, it's affecting you and you probably don't know. So this is why we continue to demand for climate justice. Climate justice is racial justice. When you're talking about racism, it is connected to climate justice. That's why we say that we cannot achieve climate justice without achieving racial justice. We cannot achieve climate justice without achieving environmental justice. We cannot achieve climate justice without achieving gender equality. This is a system that needs to be, we need to solve everything in this system. You cannot say that you're solving racism when you're not solving this other part. So we have to solve one thing to achieve the other. So this is why we need to look at this as a system. We need to work together. We need to collaborate together, the global north and the global south. We all need each other. Well, today in Africa, the present is already catastrophic. For the global north, I don't think the impacts are too far to reach you. So we need to work together and support each other and amplify each other's voice and come up with solutions together. Like the African continent, we all know that historically Africa is only responsible for less than 4% of global carbon CO2 emissions. But Africa is already suffering all these impacts. So who is responsible for the other carbon emissions? It's the global north that is responsible for the highest emissions. Africa is not responsible for climate change. And this is why, as activists, we have been demanding for climate finance. Communities in the global north promised, they made a pledge and promised 12 years back to provide climate finance for the vulnerable communities to help them in mitigation and adaptation. But we haven't seen that money yet. This money was supposed to come by 2020, but we haven't seen the money yet, and we are still asking, where is the money? We need you to show us the money right now. We need you to provide that climate finance, because the African continent does not have the capacity for adaptation and mitigation. While communities in the global north are already transitioning to a renewable system, we don't want other communities to be left behind. It has to be a just transition for all. And some communities are not able to transition on their own. So this is why we demand for climate finance to be provided now so that the African continent or other communities in the global south are able to transition. They are able to transition into renewable energy. The electric trains that we are seeing in the global north, we need to see them in the global south as well. The renewable energy that we are seeing already in the global north, we need to see this in the global south. So yes, in the global south. So this is how the climate finance is going to help communities. So we usually say that when we go to schools to educate students about climate change, sometimes they ask us a question. So if you are telling people not to cut down trees, then what are they going to feed on? Because someone is cutting down a tree because they don't have food to eat, because this is their source of income. So they ask us a question: if you are telling us to not to cut down trees, what do you expect us to feed on? And this is the answer that I can give to the world, that we cannot call it climate justice when some people are being left behind. We cannot call it climate justice when this person cannot afford a meal, and this is their only source of income. It's their only source of income, and they don't have any other option. So this is why climate finance is very important, to help this person who can only depend on this tree for survival, to help them find another source of income. And again, we are asking for this climate finance, not in form of loans, but in form of grants. Because the African continent is not responsible for the climate crisis, and this is a form for the global north to pay for the crisis that they caused. And I have been explaining to you the disasters that are happening, millions of people that are dying. This is very clear that loss and damage is already happening. And activists have been asking governments in the global north to provide a separate fund for loss and damage, because the climate finance for mitigation and adaptation is not just enough. Loss and damage is already happening, and people need to recover from loss and damage. And this loss and damage, we are not begging for this money. We are just asking the global north to pay for what they caused, to pay for a crisis that they have caused, because people are suffering, because people are dying, because they are not, people don't have any other means to come out of this crisis. So the African continent needs climate justice. We are demanding for climate justice. We are demanding for climate finance. We demand a phase out of fossil fuels, and an upscaling of renewable energy, because we believe that another world is possible, another world where everyone has a right to clean air, to clean water, to a clean environment is possible. Another world where people have the right to their heritages is possible. Because I told you that East African crude oil pipeline has already displaced people, and people have lost their heritages. But if we invest in renewable energy, people will be able to remain in their cultures. People will be able to remain in their heritages. So as the African people, we are demanding for climate justice. We are demanding for climate finance. To all the leaders in the global north and the leaders that are listening to us, we demand for climate justice. We demand justice for the African continent, and we demand you to listen to the people and to put the people and the planet above the profit. Thank you.